Since the beginning of a full-scale war of Russia against Ukraine, I hoped the war would not last long. And I think I wasn't the only one who believed that sanctions would choke Russia and Russian ruble would inflate, that no one would cooperate with the terrorist state and the dictator declared internationally wanted. But the reality is entirely different. Sanctions aren't working. The West imposes sanctions and Russia circumvents them. Russian propaganda still freely poisons the world.
What anti-Ukrainian narratives does it promote?
Putin gains new supporters in Europe. Firstly, Fico claimed that Ukraine was not a sovereign, independent country, and yesterday he did notice rocket attacks on Kyiv. My name is Ruslan Sharipov. I'm a TV host. Here already the third year I've been broadcasting the news. I can't understand how this is possible. I want to find the answer, so I embark on a trip across the Europe with leading journalists, researchers and high-level officials to find out how Kremlin can still influence the world. There's a real danger of tapping all these conversations. What mechanisms do they use?
This is an organization that has existed for over 100 years.
What weak points do they press? Russians have some compromising evidence on Viktor Orban. What levers of influence do they use? Was it a tent of the Russian army? Yes, it was. And all this is going in Europe. This event takes place in Germany. How does the Kremlin turn ballet and balalaikas into weapons? These are quite innocent reasons at the first glance. I will find answers to these questions in the most unexpected places. Near the Gagarin statue at the Danish Technical University, 400 meters away from the Eiffel Tower, and on a memorial plaque in the historical center of Bratislava. This is an investigative documentary that will help you understand how widely Russia has spread its influence in the world. How threatening is it to us today? And who is trying to delay our victory and how? Russian octopus. How Kremlin influences the world. I'm going to Denmark. This Scandinavian country was the first to announce the transfer of F-16 aircrafts and Leopard tanks to Ukraine, which we desperately needed, and the first to sign an allied security agreement with Ukraine. At the same time, as it has been revealed recently, Denmark has been the target of Russian special services for quite a long time. In early 2022, the country was stirred up by a serious espionage scandal. The Danish authorities expelled 15 Russian diplomats from the country, accusing them of espionage. What exactly were Russian undercover spies hunting in Denmark? Has their network been wholly dismantled? Can Russia influence Ukraine's support level in the Scandinavian countries today? I am interested in finding the answer to this question most of all. But first we have to find out what exactly Russian agents under diplomatic cover were doing in Denmark. Investigative journalists have begun doing this. One of them agreed to meet with me to tell me about the Russian spy network in Denmark and one high-profile exposure. This is Lasse Skue Andersen, an investigative journalist for the famous Danish newspaper Information. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you too. What was the case? The Russian spy Alexei Nikiforov has been convicted recently. He was in contact with his handler at the Russian embassy, a certain Timur Rasulov, the first secretary at the embassy. They used to meet at the sushi restaurant in Longbu. Right here? Yes. At this place? Yeah. There was a picture declassified by the security service showing them meeting at this sushi bar. His position at the embassy was for Timur Rasulov a cover. As far as we know, he was the Russian SVR, FIS officer working as a diplomat under diplomatic cover. But he was actually a spy. He was recruiting and handling Nikiforov, and then somehow sending the obtained from Nikiforov information to Russia. This story became scandalous because, unlike Timur Rasulov, a Russian spy under diplomatic cover, Alexei Nikiforov was an ordinary Russian. He came to Denmark from Moscow to study back in 2008 year. They recognized the potential of the Russian student and later gave Nikiforov the opportunity to write his dissertation in Denmark and complete his postgraduate studies. After that, the Russian arranged his life here. He built a career, bought an apartment and created a family. He became a father and, as Danish journalists found out, he was recruited by Russian special services at one of these stages of his life. Why do you think they chose Nikiforov? He was a scientist working on very interesting technologies that might be of interest to Russia and Russia's national security interests. Nikiforov worked not far from here, at the Danish Technical University. Let's go there to have a look at the place of his work. Russia has been interested in that university for several reasons. The Danish Technical University is one of the most potent Scandinavian research centers in technology and innovation. I was thinking Lasse would show me the laboratory where Alexei Nikiforov worked, but there is something more attractive on the university campus territory. Oh, Yuri Gagarin. What a surprise! Yeah, this bust was the official gift to Denmark from the Russian state. You can see the inscription on the plaque saying that was a gift from the Russian embassy, the ambassador Mikhail Vanin. The interesting fact is the bust was installed here in 2016, 2 years later after the illegal annexation of Crimea. Stop, I am telling you! Of course, the Danish government condemned this annexation, but still, 2 years later, the official collaboration, like in this case, was taking place. The ambassador came here at the opening and everyone smiled and applauded. Life was going on. The Danes perceived the installing Gagarin's bust at the Technical University as a normal cultural event. However, journalists' investigations shows that the Russians had other motives. Look closer at the background of this photo. This is Artem Markaryan. At that time, he was the head of the Rossotrudnichestvo, cooperation with Russia, in Denmark. I think he put a lot of effort to have installed this bust here. It was the result of his work. Of course, the official reasons would be scientific cooperation. It was supposed to show the Danes the greatness of the Russian culture. These are quite innocent reasons and intentions at the first glance. When the lectures are held, they look at this image of wonderful hero, the Russian man, Yuri Alexeyevich Gagarin, every time. The Russians claim that Rossotrudnichestvo is an agency that aims to introduce Russian culture to the world. But the additional questions arise. Rossotrudnichestvo is an official Russian state agency. Does it also have a hidden agenda? We can see from our research that Russia and Russian spies were very interested in what's going on here at the Danish Technical University, and it was not the cultural connections they were interested in. What exactly interested them? In the case of the convicted spy Nikiforov, who worked at this university, he was doing research into green energy. According to the Danish Security Service, Russia considers green technology their national security threat, because they are very dependent on their exports of coal, oil and other fuels. Any technology that could replace oil would make Russia less powerful. So they really want to know what's going on and what kind of new technologies appear. And Gagarin is a kind of cultural tool? Gagarin is a cultural tool to have a reason to come here to establish some formal ties. As we have already found out, the Russian state agency called Rossotrudnichestvo was responsible for establishing those official ties, and it acted together with the Russian embassy. Alexei Nikiforov was connected to both. Nikiforov visited the Rossotrudnichestvo office in Copenhagen to play balalaika. He leaked information about Danish green technologies to his curator at the Russian embassy. While the embassy's role in this espionage story is simple and clear, the role of Rossotrudnichestvo remains quite unclear. How is this organization useful to Russians, except for the installation, the monuments and organizing cultural events? The Danish authorities have never formally charged the Rossotrudnichestvo. I am now at Copenhagen's main building of this Russian cultural organization. Here it is. It is a 3-story building with an attic. Seeing the architecture of this building, you understand that it is a perfect place for spies. Why? In the local archives, I have found a plan for this building from 1974. Here is the facade part. It can be seen from the street. Then there is a large area of the building, a courtyard. And there's a secret entrance hidden from the prying eyes. It's a perfect place for spy meetings. A site for secret meetings with a sign saying House of Culture. This could be one of the functions of Rossotrudnichestvo in Russian espionage schemes abroad. Who would ever think of checking a cultural institution for agents? But then why did Alexei Nikiforov meet with his embassy handler in a sushi bar? It looks like the Rossotrudnichestvo posed a more significant threat. After all, after Russia's full-scale invasion into Ukraine, the Danish authorities, along with the expulsion of spy diplomats, closed the organization's office in Copenhagen. By that time, the defendant in the scandalous spy case, Alexei Nikiforov, was already in prison. The espionage scandal involving the exposure of Russian citizen Alexei Nikiforov creates new challenges for foreign intelligence agencies. Look for yourself. Nikiforov arrived to Denmark in 2008. He studied here, built his career, and then at some point he was recruited by the Russian intelligence services. Now imagine how many such Russians live in Europe and throughout the world. Does this mean that every Russian passport holder outside their country is a potential spy? The second important question is about the role of Rossotrudnichestvo in Russia's espionage scheme abroad. To get all the answers, I'm meeting with Dr. Flemming Splidsboll Hansen in Copenhagen, a Russia case expert at the Danish Institute of International Studies and author of Putin's War book. Dr. Splidsboll Hansen is a former analyst with the Danish Military Intelligence Service. He is well aware of how the special services work. Is every Russian citizen with Russian passport in Europe a potential threat now? No, not every Russian is a potential threat. We have one really high-ranking case and a very prominent case with a Russian citizen. But I'm sure that people in the police security service are probably more aware of this and more attentive about this now. But not every Russian living here is a threat or potential threat. Can you explain why do you think so? Well, because some of them live here for a long time and are the part of the Danish society. They have jobs, families, and prove themselves well. But we could say the same words about Nikiforov. Yeah, we could. But he had this inclination to work for the Russian government, to steal and transmit the information. Not everyone is capable of such things. The inclination Mr. Splidsboll Hansen is talking about can be well traced on Alexei Nikiforov's Facebook page. It's a nostalgia for military service, St. George's ribbons and some narratives about Russia as a great country and so on. In my opinion, these are clear markers of Nikiforov's way of thinking, indicating his willingness to help his homeland. We don't know exactly how many Russians with such tendencies live in the Scandinavian countries cooperating with the Russian special services. Only one story of Alexei Nikiforov recruited by the Russian special services has become public. The Danish authorities leaked the materials of this case to journalists on purpose. Such sort of information becomes public because our intelligence community would like to inform the society about Russian threat, to show people there's one so that they should be aware of it for their own safety. Just as we are speaking now, one can see on Copenhagen streets the signs of the PR campaign the intelligence service is running now. You can see posters on the bus stop saying, for instance, Danish research is really good. They agree with this in Moscow. So these things are supposed to attract the attention of people who work in research institutes. They are warning them to protect their data and computers, to check who they communicate with. They also warn them not having meetings with wrong people. Although in Denmark, after the exposure of Alexei Nikiforov, they do not share the opinion that every holder of a Russian passport is a potential spy, the Danish authorities informally and unofficially make it clear to their citizens that those Russians who are in close contact with Russian state organizations pose a possible threat to their society. These are Russian embassies, consulates, universities, and various cultural organizations such as Rossotrudnichestvo. Only one question remains. What was the role of Rossotrudnichestvo in the development and functioning of the Russian spy network in Denmark? It could be a screening before recruitment. Or it could be the recruitment itself. Well, it could work perhaps through some events. Let's say they organized an event, a concert, for example, and approach the people who attended the concert. So it could be a relatively innocent event, a piano concert, and people would show up. Maybe someone from the agency would be looking out to see if there was anyone they could speak to. Young students, journalists, or someone else that could be interesting for them to speak to. Their approach is more careful and subtle. If you attend an event and someone from the Russian embassy steps up, it can alert you. But if it's someone from Rossotrudnichestvo, it may be easier. It's just someone from the cultural agency. Now it is clear how it works. We don't know how Alexei Nikiforov was recruited. However, the fact that he frequently visited the Rossotrudnichestvo office in Copenhagen does not exclude the possibility that this is how Russian special services made their first contact with him. Being a platform for screening and collecting information about those who tend to cooperate with the special services is one of the roles the Russian special services assign Rossotrudnichestvo. The limited opportunities to recruit agents in Denmark, the Russians are now resorting to cruder forms of espionage. For example, in the spring of 2023, a new espionage scandal erupted in Denmark when Danish radio journalists published a photo of an unmarked man with an assault rifle on a Russian marine research vessel. According to intelligence services and experts, the Russian military program is currently mapping offshore wind farms, gas pipelines, power and internet cables in the waters around Denmark, Norway, Finland and Sweden. The mapping is being done by a large number of military and civilian ships that are cruising around the Scandinavian waters and revealing what lies at the bottom of the sea and how our infrastructure is connected. Danish Radio, 19th of April 2023. Russia's use of military intelligence in Danish waters demonstrates the effectiveness of the Danish authorities' decision to close Rossotrudnichestvo. What about other countries? How influential is Rossotrudnichestvo around the world? How many branches does its network has and who stands behind it? To get answers to these questions, I meet with Nadia Koval, the head of the Analytical Research and Academic Programs Department at the Ukrainian Institute. Ms. Nadia is the author of the analytical note Rossotrudnichestvo, Unbearable Rigidity of a Soft Power. She knows everything about this organization.
This organization has existed for more than 100 years, about 100 actually. It continues the traditions of Soviet cultural diplomacy. The first organization of such cultural diplomacy in the Soviet Union was the All Union Society for Cultural Relations Abroad, better known by its abbreviation VOKS. It was established in 1925. Quite essential in the Soviet Union system, functionaries run it, and they did straightforward things. They tried to bring to the Soviet Union writers, artists, and journalists to show the Soviet Union in a certain way, so that they, returning to their countries, would create a more favorable public opinion for possible cooperation in future. To tell them that, for example, the Soviet Union is not some wild country. On the contrary, it's a country with a great culture, a country where everything is developing, everything is beautiful and dynamic, so they should not ignore it.
Did this policy bear fruit?
It did bear fruit. In the 1930s, they succeed in a very serious way. This policy helped the Soviet Union to maintain its legitimacy on the international arena during the Stalinist era, during the times of Stalinist repressions and the Holodomor.
Since then, 100 years later, the world has evolved so much that it seemed impossible to hide crimes such as the shooting of civilians in Bucha or the missile shellings of the Ukrainian cities. Back in the 1930s, thanks to the organization predecessor of Rossotrudnichestvo, the Soviet Union concealed crimes of that scope. Today, one could consider the old Soviet methods useless and ineffective, except for one thing.
If we take the countries that have not imposed sanctions on these institutions, such as Turkey, China, India, and Egypt, we'll see that the pro-war propaganda there is in full swing. For example, on the anniversary of the full-scale invasion, they made up to 5 different documentaries about the Maidan, Ukraine, the Ukrainian army, the situation on the occupied territories, and show them in certain representative offices.
It turns out Rossotrudnichestvo's activities go far beyond the European continent. Now the question arises, how many such cultural offices does Russia have worldwide?
After the Second World War, the Cold War began, and accordingly, the priorities of this Russian cultural, in fact, Soviet diplomacy, at that time shifted. They began to pay more attention to the countries of the Third World, which we call now the Global South countries. Then, such reincarnation of this Russian cultural diplomacy manifested itself in numerous societies of friendship and cultural ties with foreign countries. At that time, they were formed worldwide in sympathetic countries. They began working more on educational cooperation, actively bringing African, Asian, and other students to the Soviet Union.
I see that the name of the organization itself has changed.
Yes, it was already called the Soviet Communities of Friendship and Cultural Relations with Foreign Countries.
Despite of changing its name, the newly created Union of Soviet Friendship Societies inherited its organization's predecessor, its entire infrastructure and contacts abroad. Thanks to heredity and this approach, today Russia's international network of cultural missions is one of the largest in the world.
The network includes almost 100 countries, up to 100 offices in approximately 87 countries worldwide.
After the dissolution of the USSR, Russia inherited the network of cultural missions worldwide as the successor to the Soviet Union. In the Russian Federation, this international cultural organization underwent 2 more minor rebrandings to acquire its modern status under the name Rossotrudnichestvo.
The Orange Revolution in Ukraine, in fact, was a turning point for Putin personally. The Orange Revolution was the first massive social upheaval showing that Western values and Western culture are more interesting for Ukraine, for most of the nation, than Russian ones. So the Orange Revolution of 2004 years was the first turning point. The second turning point was Russian aggression against Georgia. They carried it out in August 2008, and right after this, in September 2008, they founded the Rossotrudnichestvo.
That's an interesting observation.
They realized that people did not accept their narrative about this conflict, and the image of Russia was terrible. They needed to do something about it. Since then, the history of the familiar to us modern Rossotrudnichestvo has started. This dough with an olive branch.
The decree of the Rossotrudnichestvo Foundation was issued by the Russian President Dmitry Medvedev after the attack on Georgia in 2008. According to the official documents, Rossotrudnichestvo is subordinated to the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But if you read the paragraph 3, Organization of Activities, you'll see that the head of Rossotrudnichestvo is appointed and dismissed personally by the President of the Russian Federation. This indicates the great importance of this organization for the Kremlin.
The head of Rossotrudnichestvo is Sam Yevgeny Primakov Jr., the grandson of Yevgeny Primakov Sr. I think Yevgeny Primakov Sr. is well known to many people. He is a relatively famous Russian politician who was once the head of the Foreign Intelligence Service, the Prime Minister of Russia and the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs. The post-Soviet nomenclatura and its descendants run all these institutions.
Given the true motives behind Rossotrudnichestvo's activities in Europe, it is a great mystery that the organization's headquarters operates from the heart of Berlin. It is naive to believe that the German intelligence services are unaware of Rossotrudnichestvo's covert activities. But the Russian agency continues to work here. New posters with cultural events appear every month. I saw this with my own eyes, having arrived in Berlin at the end of February 2024. The representative office of Rossotrudnichestvo is called here Russische Haus, which means Russian house in German. On the day of my stay in Berlin, the poster of the Russian house lists a screening of a short documentary scheduled for 7 p.m. I will attend this event in the evening and try to film what is going on inside and what kind of audience attends it. In the meantime, I'm heading to the other side of Berlin to the local prosecutor's office, where a statement by former Green Party member of the Bundestag, Volker Beck, demanding that the Russian house's activities in Berlin should be stopped, lies without consideration more than a year. I am meeting here with Volker Beck's representative in this case, a lawyer Patrick Heinemann. What is the status of this case? Well, the thing is, we don't really know. First, they had closed down the criminal investigation against the director of the Russian house because, as it turned out, he had a diplomatic immunity. But then we said, well, what about all the other people who worked there violating all the sanctions that were taking place? They sell tickets for their events and conduct language courses. They even have opened a restaurant just a couple of months ago. They opened a bookshop there. We demanded to let us see the case papers, but they didn't allow us to. They never gave any specific answers to our questions. It turns out that Rossotrudnichestvo is subject to EU sanctions imposed on the agency after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I sent an official letter to the Berlin prosecutor's office with the same questions as the lawyer Patrick Heinemann had. Still, by the time this film was aired, I have not received any response. I see a couple of violations here. For example, the Russian house run by Rossotrudnichestvo, Russian state agency that is sanctioned under EU law, shouldn't be allowed to rent premises there to other people and make money renting premises. Do they own this Russian house? Yes, they do. And this is stated in the international treaty between the Russian Federation and the Federal Republic of Germany.
The Rossotrudnichestvo representative office in Ukraine was closed in spring of 2021. Count that year of war it was and imagine how difficult it was. A bilateral agreement determined its existence in the country. It takes time and effort to break off diplomatic ties or terminate critical international contracts in international relations. So institutionally, this system is very well protected.
It took Ukraine 8 years to close the Rossotrudnichestvo offices in Kyiv and Odessa. They worked in Ukraine according to their usual program, including the Russian world propaganda and anti-Ukrainian activities. The functioning of the organization in Ukraine was determined by the international agreement between Ukraine and Russia in 1998. This is a certain paradox because Russia has flagrantly violated the international law by annexing Ukrainian territory and starting the war in the east of Ukraine. At the same time, Ukraine has respected the international treaties with Russia, permitting Rossotrudnichestvo representative offices in Kyiv and Odessa to operate until recently. It remains unclear how the German authorities will resolve the dilemma of Rossotrudnichestvo's operation in Berlin. On one hand, as in the case of Ukraine, Rossotrudnichestvo is protected here by an international treaty between Germany and Russia. It is unlikely that the Germans will go to the extent of breaking it. On the other hand, Rossotrudnichestvo is under EU sanctions. This would require the German authorities to take certain actions concerning this organization. This is what the lawyer Patrick Heinemann seeks. There's one more interesting case I wanted to tell you about, but it's in another place. Shall we go there? Let's go. Patrick Heinemann offers a ride from the prosecutor's office to the Brandenburg Gate, the main visiting card of Berlin situated nearby. So, Patrick, what do you think is the main reason that prevents them from closing the Russian house?
Well, the thing is,
Well, the thing is, there's the tradition of leniency towards Russia in Germany. And a lot of people have been sympathizing with Russia during the past 20-30 years. So that's one reason. At the same time, many people are afraid of Russia very much, taking Russian threats very seriously. But what do you think about the politicians? Because the thing isn't about the people having a sympathy for Russia or not. So it's the matter of politics, isn't it? And the politicians themselves. In fact, it's a matter of European law. I mean, the sanctions have been applied at the European level. And Germany shouldn't behave selectively about the imposition of sanctions. I think Germany should also enforce the sanctions regarding the Russian house. At the same time, we hear that Russians are threatening to close the Goethe Institute, which is the cultural representative office of Germany in Moscow. Responding with threats is a standard Russian tactic that the Germans still take into account. The strategic nuclear forces are in complete readiness for guaranteed use. We arrive at the Brandenburg Gate and Patrick Heinemann takes me to a massive building nearby. We're standing in front of the Russian embassy. It's right here. Something interesting happened here. My friends wanted to put here in front of the embassy the Russian tank destroyed at the battlefield. They appealed for the permit to local Berlin authorities. But my friends were refused out of fear of Russian reaction. They came up with many excuses why it couldn't be done. When I read about this in the news, I got in touch with them and offered them to apply to the court. They agreed. We went to court and won the case. So we were able to install a wrecked Russian tank right here in front of the embassy in 2023, on the 24th of February, 1 year later after the full-scale invasion in Ukraine, as a sign of a protest. We had lots of people coming here to look at the tank. They climbed on it, waved the Ukrainian flag, and it was a great event. Nice. And what is the difference between two cases? I mean, stopping the Russian house operating and installing the Russian tank here. As for the Russian house, it's a criminal case, which means that the public prosecutor's office is responsible. And they're in charge of the investigation, so there's not much you can do as a private person. And when you want to put a Russian tank in front of the Russian embassy as a sign of protest, it's a matter of freedom of speech, so you can bring the case to court on your own. I think that the story of the shut-down Russian tank proves that to close the Russian house in Berlin is possible if there was a political will to do so. The dusk is coming in Berlin. 10 minutes before 7 p.m., I'm approaching the Russian house to attend screening of the documentary film to find out how the institution is functioning despite the sanctions imposed on Rossotrudnichestvo. It looks inside like an ordinary house of culture. There are exhibitions of photo works on the walls. People are gathering for the event, but there are not many of them. I'm openly filming everything and no one pays attention. It all looks completely innocent. Obviously, the same atmosphere prevailed in the Copenhagen office of Rossotrudnichestvo. The only difference is the investigation has been conducted there, and one of its active visitors was found to be involved in espionage activities. I have no idea whether German intelligence services study the visitors' activities to the Russian house in Berlin. So I decided to conduct my own investigation. I have studied the repertoire of the Russian house in Berlin in recent months and looked for the information about the visitors in open sources. I came across one interesting poster. The Russian house in Berlin will host the incredible concert by the choir of Don Cossacks under the direction of Professor Petya Khudyakov. The poster was published on Facebook on the 20th of December 2023. The Christmas concert of the Don Cossack choir at the Russian house has attracted my attention. This is the same organization of Don Cossacks that Vladimir Putin took to the wedding of Karin Kneißl, the Austrian foreign minister at that time, in summer of 2018. At this photo from the wedding you can see the Cossacks entertaining the guests. The Don Cossacks are still perceived in Europe as a kind of attraction. Some cheerful men in colorful clothes. I associate Russian Cossacks with something completely different, Russia's armed aggression against Ukraine. For example, in 2014, in Crimea, the men of Cossack Ataman Minich helped the Russian military to block Ukrainian military units. We blocked the access to the electricity. We cut off their electricity. Why did you cut off their electricity? Minich said so. We don't know anything. Don't blame us. And in the Luhansk region as of November 2014, the Don Cossacks under the leadership of Ataman Kozitsyn controlled 85% of the occupied part of the region and continued to the active part in the fighting on the Ukrainian territories. The media widely covered all these militaristic manifestations of the Russian Cossack on the Ukrainian territories. It would be wrong to assume that Europe is unaware of this, but apparently Russian Cossacks are still divided into two camps here: the aggressive Cossacks living in Russia and foreign Cossacks who live peacefully, entertaining guests at weddings, who gather several times a year to sing songs in the Russian house. In early 2023, the journalists from the Reuters agency proved this to be a misconception. The journalists attended a pro-Russian rally in the German city of Cologne. Among the security guards of this rally, they identified a member of the Hanoverian Cossack organization. His name is Andriy Harkovsky. Here he is being caught by camera filming the pro-Russian rally in Cologne. He is wearing dark glasses and a headset in his ear. He is in plain clothes, not to attract their necessary attention. They managed to identify him by the specific tattoos on his arms. This fact proves that there's someone in Europe who can, if necessary, defend the ideas of the Russian world that are being voiced from the stage in Cologne, Germany, in the midst of Russia's large-scale invasion of Ukraine. Who are these people, the members of Russian Cossack organizations in Europe? How well is their network developed here? How does it function and who runs it? I found an insider in Germany who knows everything about Russian Cossack organizations because he was once involved in this movement. This is Serhiy Azhinov. Until 2014, he lived in the Russian town Novocherkassk. He was engaged in public activities and covered the work of local Cossack organizations until he was arrested by the FSB and imprisoned for supporting the Ukrainian Maidan. Serhiy does not disclose the details of his biography and asks not to name the place of our meeting because he is still worried about his safety. Using his insider information, I want to create a portrait of Russian Cossacks in Europe and find out who these people are. As you see, they gathered in the open air, put up tents. Here is their chief ataman, the chief ataman of Europe as he calls himself. Who is he? His name is Grigory Kremer. He considers himself the main Cossack of Europe, as well as his audience fans of the Russian world. He is a Jewish immigrant who came here 30 years ago, and the Russian Cossack movement is his favorite field of activity. They wear uniforms. Yes, everything is militarized there. They really like to look threatening. Fingerless gloves, all sorts of Navy SEALs t-shirts. If I'm not mistaken, this is a Russian tent. Oh, that was a Russian army tent. If I'm not mistaken, let's rewind it. Here it is. This one, right? Yes. All this takes place in Europe, right? That's right, it's Europe. This particular event is taking place in Germany. When I went to meet Serhiy to hear about Russian Cossacks in Europe, I did not expect to see a Russian army tent or a Russian-speaking man dressed in military style in the middle of a German forest. Russian Cossacks do all this openly. The video that Serhiy shows me was filmed in 2022 by the Cossacks themselves on the outskirts of the German city Hanover. They also put this video in the public domain and called it International Cossack Bivouac. Even the word bivouac has a militaristic connotation. Bivouac is an army campsite for overnight stays or rest. Here they got together. Who is coming up to them? This is a man we already know, Kharkovsky. Kharkovsky? Yes, yes. He has a very distinctive tattoo, the goatee and the height. This is the one who guarded the rally in Cologne. So he was given an operative task by the Ataman Kremlin because they never do such things on their own initiative. To see a security guard from the pro-Russian rally Kharkovsky at a paramilitary gathering of Russian Cossacks in Germany is another surprise for me. It proves that Cossack organizations in this country are very well organized. They come from France, Netherlands, Poland, from everywhere, wherever the so-called Russian Cossacks live. It turns out that Russian Cossacks are present in almost all European countries. Here they are at the unveiling of a monument to Peter Potemkin in southern Spain. This is the celebration of the May 9 in the Spanish city of Malaga. In France, the Cossacks are the most active in Paris. Once they even organized a memorial service for the terrorist Zakharchenko with DPR flags. This is a relatively large network that consists of little cells. Some of them may be called pretentiously, such as the Cossack Stanitsa village of Berlinska. In fact, there could be 5-6 permanent members. Well, maybe about 30 people will gather there for some religious holidays. There are not many of them, but they are still influential. Up to 30 people from one Hamburg or Berlin village is not much. It doesn't correspond to the historical spirit that Russian Cossacks in Europe follow. In the old days, a Cossack village was considered a military settlement capable of fielding 100 Cossacks for an army. As a true descendant of the Don Cossacks, Serhiy Azhinov says that all historical inconsistencies do not matter to people who call themselves Russian Cossacks in Europe. They are not descendants of the Cossacks. Their participation in the Cossack movement is just a cover. Basically, most of them are former police officers and former army or intelligence agencies personnel and so on. Okay, but what about the Europeans themselves? Do they not know about this? To be honest, I'm surprised. If I had a chance to talk to representatives of European intelligence agencies, I would ask a lot of questions about how they are simply nurturing a Trojan horse on their own land. If the negative forecasts come true and Russia will go to war against Europe, these people will act as spotters, gathering operational valuable information for the front because that's how they are trained. At the beginning of 2024, the German edition Bild reported, for over a year, the military in Germany has been detecting unknown drones over Bundeswehr training grounds and barracks where the Ukrainian soldiers are also being trained. The Germans see a Russian connection, but who launched these reconnaissance drones remains a mystery. Russia cannot launch drones into Germany from its territory. Could Russian agents in Germany, former security officers disguised as Cossacks, have done this? I would not rule them out from the list of suspects. As you can see, the Cossacks have their quasi-administrative units called stanitsas in Europe. Several times a year, all European Cossacks gather for paramilitary training known as bivouacs. And now the question arises, who is actually behind the Cossacks in Europe? The clue is given by the same video of the Cossacks from the international paramilitary gatherings near German Hanover. Here we have a Cossack settlement in the city of Hamburg. In the freeze frame near the tent, you can see a sign with the inscription Cossack Stanitsa City of Hamburg. And at the bottom, the abbreviation SKVRZ. The decoding of this abbreviation reveals the main mystery: who is behind the Russian Cossacks in Europe? All these Cossack organizations in Europe are united by one large organization called the Union of Cossack Warriors of Russia and Abroad. At the first glance, as they position themselves, this is a public organization, which means a community organization where logically its members should join on a voluntary basis. But there's one nuance. Under President Putin's administration, an entire Council for Cossack Affairs was established. The Council under the President of the Russian Federation for Cossack Affairs is a governmental organization. You can even see this in the documents. There is a document on the public service of the Russian Cossacks. There is even a document about some state policy strategy of the Russian Federation regarding the Russian Cossacks up to the year of 2030. And this, of course, refers to the Cossacks both in Russia and abroad. If in Russia itself President Putin's administration has the unlimited power and can oversee and directly manage Cossack organizations, it seems that abroad this function is carried out by another institution. I would like to specifically mention the Russian Orthodox Church, that has a significant influence in Europe, including the influence on various Cossack organizations that it, so to speak, patronizes. As the evidence to support his words, Serhiy pointed me to a fragment of the same video shot in Germany, where Russian Cossacks gathered for a paramilitary training. We have talked with Father just now. With Victor, right? Yes. Okay, let's go to have a serious talk on this matter now. In this video fragment, we see already familiar to us Kharkovsky mentioning the presence of a priest named Victor at the Cossack gatherings in Hanover. If we look at the map of European branches of the Russian Orthodox Church and the activity of Russian Cossacks in Europe, the symbiosis of Russian Cossacks and the Church is very well traced. You can see on this map that in Germany, Russian Orthodox Church has the largest number of parishes. You can also observe the highest activity of Cossack organizations. Our investigation shows us at least 4 Cossack centers in Berlin, Hamburg, Hanover, and Cologne. The Russian Orthodox Church has as many as 8 parishes in Berlin, 4 in Hamburg, 3 in Hanover, and 2 ones in Cologne. Russian Cossacks in Spain are the most active in the Andalusia region. The Russian Orthodox Church here has one of the largest Spanish representation with 4 parishes in different cities of Andalusia. In France, the few parishes of the Russian Orthodox Church are scattered throughout the country. But in Paris and its suburbs, where Cossacks participate in rallies with flags of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, there are as many as 11 parishes of the Russian Orthodox Church. This is the largest concentration of Russian Orthodox Church representations among all major European capitals. Moreover, Paris is also the unique example of expanding of Russia Orthodox Church with a complex of buildings in the city center 8 years ago that caused a significant concern among the public regarding the threats this complex could pose to France's national security. Russians call this a spiritual cultural Orthodox center. The well-known French theologian and religious scholar Antoine Arjakovsky has another opinion about its true essence. In April 2023, he appealed to the French people on his Facebook page, asking to sign a petition about closing Russian spiritual culture Orthodox Center in Paris. Why did the construction of the Russian center in this location cause so much concern in 2016? First of all, the Élysée Palace is not far from this center, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs buildings are located nearby. There's a significant risk of overhearing all the conversations that take place nearby. I used to work at the French embassy in Russia. We found out later that they listened to all our conversations and read all our telegrams. So we have a good reason to worry. Although there is not any direct evidence of wiretapping of French government buildings by Russian Spiritual and Cultural Orthodox Center in Paris in 2023, they were caught to be engaged in such activity in Moldova. Investigative journalists identified Russian intelligence communication officers on the roof of the Russian embassy in Chisinau. One of them appeared on the roof near the antennas when the hacker attack on the internet resources of the Moldovan government and the president's administration was taking place. As a result of this attack, there was a leak of confidential correspondence of Moldovan high-ranking officials. It's notable that the presidential palace and the parliament building of the Republic of Moldova are located only 600 meters away from the Russian embassy with its dangerous antennas. This is one of the key points. It becomes evident that Russians require infrastructure near the chosen target for such special operations. Didn't the French assess the level of the threat, allocating a plot for Russians to construct a whole complex of buildings 900 meters away from the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs and close to the official residences of the president's administration staff? Back then, Sarkozy was the president, and many people understood that it was a kind of a trade-off. We allow you to buy this spot, and you in turn buy the Mistral from us.
Ви придбаєте у нас Містралі.
We're talking about the year of 2010. At the end of the year, the French announced the agreement with the Russians about the construction and selling 2 Mistral-class military ships to them. France would receive €1,700,000,000 from this deal, and as it turned out, was supposed to make a small concession to the Russians, allowing them to purchase the land in central Paris to construct a spiritual and cultural Orthodox center. After the annexation of Crimea, France refused to hand over the ships to Russia and paid a hefty fine for it, but the plot in central Paris remained in the hands of the Russians. The French could not back out of this project anymore.
Було домовлено,
It was agreed
що цей центр
that this center would get the extraterritorial status.
фактично
In fact, it's Russia,
і цьому неможливо.
and it's impossible to resist this in any way.
Після анексії Криму,
After the annexation of Crimea,
навіть після
and even after the full-scale invasion of the Russian army in Ukraine,
тут,
there were demonstrations here.
але ми не
But we
змогли
couldn't achieve the complete closure of this center
відкриття цього центру через
because of its embassy status.
посольства.
In Paris, Russians successfully used the same scheme as in Berlin. The Russian Spiritual and Cultural Orthodox Center in the French capital initially became the subject of intergovernmental agreements in a significant deal. Then it acquired a diplomatic immunity which actually prevented its closure. The presence of a church on its premises also grants this center a certain immunity. Any country in the world doesn't want to be seen as a state that forcibly closes churches. That's why the church, alongside culture and history, is a very convenient tool in the hands of the Kremlin regime. I have only indirect evidence of the church acting as a curator for Russian paramilitary Cossack organizations in Europe. But if you visit the ROC's website, you'll see that there is a select synodical committee for interaction with the Cossacks in the structure of the Russian Orthodox Church. Synodical means it's under the control of the ROC's highest hierarchy, directly Patriarch Kirill. Our investigation shows that Cossacks both in Russia and abroad are united by one organization, the Union of Cossack Warriors of Russia and Abroad, abbreviated as SKVRZ. In Russia, this organization is handled by a council under the president. At the same time, the Russian Orthodox Church carries out this mission abroad. Such connection between the Russian Church and the Cossacks proves that in case of necessity, any Russian church in Europe will become a reliable shelter for Russian Cossacks. The danger lies in the fact that over the past 20 years, the number of such Russian Orthodox churches in Europe has multiplied significantly.
На початку 20-го
We need to go back a little. There was a Russian Orthodox Church at the beginning of the 20th century, and since the emigration appeared, there were 2 divisions within the emigration. In 1922,
виникла
the ROCOR emerged, the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia.
Головний центр був
The main center was in Karlovka, Serbia. The split of the Russian Orthodox Church occurred as a result of the collapse of the Russian Empire in 1918. In the USSR, the church came under the direct control of Stalin and the KGB. In Europe, all the churches and parishes that were once under the care of the Russian Empire merged into one structure, the Russian Orthodox Church abroad, independent of Soviet influence. In 2007, Patriarch Kirill succeeded in having the central part of this church. The Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, ROCOR, transferred to the Moscow Patriarchate. We can observe a certain pattern, just like with Rossotrudnichestvo, the large Soviet cultural legacy that Russians revived in 1928. A year earlier, in 1927, they picked up another imperial wreckage, the Russian Orthodox Church abroad. This fits perfectly into Putin's logic, his nostalgia for the Soviet Union, and his mission to gather the Russian imperial legacy. It provided many premises and many buildings. So how does it work? For example, the Moscow Patriarchate gained a new parish or a new church, what's the mechanism of influence and what does it give them? For instance, they also opened a church in Strasbourg, in France, where the Parliament and the Council of Europe are located. They invite diplomats, parliamentarians, and various politicians. They present themselves as the largest church in the world. So it's not just about the premises and parishes. It gives them reputation, legitimizing them. Yes, the reputation, legitimization, and the means of influence. For example, in Strasbourg, I saw it with my own eyes how extreme parties like the Rassemblement National, led by Marine Le Pen, or the extreme left, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, have regular meetings there for a week every month. They meet not only with representatives of the Russian embassy and consulate, but with the church representatives as well. This means that in addition to handling paramilitary Cossack organizations, the Russian Orthodox Church in Europe also serves as a soft power. The concept of soft power emerged in the 20th century and refers to the ability to achieve desired outcomes through the cooperation and attractiveness. So what does the ROC attract with? Paradoxically, one of the answers is its zero tolerance towards the LGBT community and its global advocacy for traditional family values preached by Patriarch Kirill. These views are also shared by European far-right parties, including the French National Front, led by Marine Le Pen. It's no secret that many countries use soft power in geopolitics to advance their interests. However, the difference between Russians and the civilized countries is that their influence is destructive, aimed at sowing chaos and disinformation. One of the main tasks of Russian disinformation policy is to undermine the trust of the population in European institutions. According to political expert Anton Shekhovtsov, this is another point that unites Russians with far-right parties in Europe. According to Kremlin experts and Russian pro-regime analysts, Europe is moving towards strengthening right-wing radical movements and parties. Moreover, it is also believed, not only by Kremlin experts or political technologists, that extreme right-wing parties and movements are inherently subversive, working against the establishment. This is exactly what Russia needs at a given historical moment. The fragmentation of the political establishment in those countries that Russia considers unfriendly. Russia begins active cooperation with European far-right radicals after 2013. The open financing by the Kremlin of the pre-election campaign of the French far-right party National Front, led by Marine Le Pen, was one of the most notable collaborations. What did such cooperation give the Kremlin back then? Does Russia maintain influence over far-right parties in Europe today? Are these parties capable of influencing European Union policy? How many votes can they gather in the European Parliament elections that will take place at the beginning of June this year? I expect an overall strengthening of far-right factions. And again, it's not a fact that all these far-right groups will advocate for Russia. But the number of far-right Eurodeputies may influence the election of the new president of the European Commission. And this is important. The European Commission is the EU funds administrator. According to the Kyiv Institute of World Economics, as of the beginning of 2024, the total financial assistance from the European Union to Ukraine was 3 times higher than the volume of the same assistance from the United States. EU funds cover a significant portion of the Ukraine's budgetary expenditures and help to sustain our economy. The current president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, made the final decision on allocating this assistance. Perhaps von der Leyen won't be re-elected. She advocates for Ukraine and criticizes the Russian Federation. But perhaps some strengthening of Eurosceptics, anti-American MEPs and anti-Atlantic deputies will influence the election of the new European Commission. The strengthening of Eurosceptics is a trend that seems to be gaining momentum in Europe. In the EU country of Slovakia, in autumn of 2023, Robert Fico came to power. He is a politician who openly praised Putin before his large-scale invasion and now calls on Ukraine to surrender the occupied territories to Russia. After Fico's party won the local elections, the direct military assistance to Ukraine stopped. Although Slovakia is a small country, in the first months of the large-scale invasion, it provided Ukraine with the much-needed air defense system S-300 and was the first to respond together with Poland to Kyiv's request for aircrafts by transferring 13 MiG-29 fighters to the Ukrainian Air Force. I'm coming to Slovakia to find out what happened to its political establishment. Why has Slovakia, that wholeheartedly supported Ukraine, turned into one of Kremlin's mouthpieces in Europe? Robert Fico's office did not answer to my request for an interview, so in Bratislava I'm meeting with Alexander Duleba, an advisor to the previous Slovak Prime Minister Eduard Heger. Under Heger's tenure, Ukraine at the most critical moment received the assistance from Slovakia, including the air defense system S-300 and MiG-29 fighters. Hello, Mr. Duleba. Welcome to Bratislava. Why does the Slovak political spectrum swing from pro-Western to pro-Russian views? There are many factors. One of them, quite literally, is closely connected to the place where we are meeting right now. This is the school. It was a very important school in Slovak history because many famous political figures, basically the first generation of Slovaks who formulated the political program for Slovakia, studied here. I'll show you a list of them. But one of the names is very important. As you can see here, Ludovit Stur. This is the year he graduated from this high school. He studied here. And all these people, for instance, Michal Godja, who later became the Prime Minister of Czechoslovakia in the First Republic. Let's take Samo Halupka. He was one of the leading national poets in Slovakia. So there were many people, literary men, scientists, but there were also many political figures among them. But you distinguish Stur from the others. Ludovit Stur was a leader. He was a political leader of that generation. He studied at this high school. One of the main works, I'd say one of the main books on Slovak politics, is Slavdom and the World of the Future. This book was first published in Russian in 1867, when Slovakia was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and sought to gain an autonomous status. He has very radical proposals here. There are some proposals concerning the creation of a Slavic state. If the Habsburg monarchy does not grant autonomy, a decision should be made to agree with Russia. It's kind of a message here. The more of Russia is present in Central Europe, the better it is for the national freedom of the Slovaks. At the first glance, it seems incredible that a book written in 19th century still influences Slovak perspectives today and makes many people of the population sympathetic to Russia. But one event in Slovak history that happened much closer to our time explains a lot. 1968, that's the Prague Spring. There are different perspectives on these events, say from the standpoint both of Czech and Slovak national identity. The Prague Spring was a period of political liberalization and mass protests in the communist Czechoslovak Republic in 1968. To prevent the political liberalization, the Soviet Union deployed troops to Prague and forcibly suppressed peaceful demonstrations. This is how the world history and the Czechs themselves see this event. From the perspective of Slovak national understanding, this was the progress. After all, the Czech communists didn't give us federation. Then the occupation came and Moscow realized that it was necessary to support this process. Slovakia became a federative part of Czechoslovakia. The government, the ministries and some institutions were established. It turns out that despite the dual name Czechoslovakia, before the Prague Spring, Slovaks did not have much influence or their own national government in this country. However, Slovaks gained all of this after the Prague Spring due to Moscow's intervention in the country's internal affairs. After the collapse of the USSR in 1993, Czechoslovakia split into two countries. Slovaks obtained the independent country with the same ministries and within the same administrative boundaries that were outlined in 1968 by Moscow's decree. All these historical events explain why many people are loyal to Russia today in Slovakia. Local Slovak politicians such as Robert Fico venture into the pro-Russian electoral field and gain political points with their pro-Russian statements. They exploit the situation to boost their ratings. But the question remains open. How Russians gain the loyalty of politicians in other European countries where historically there is not any pro-Russian electorate like there is in Slovakia? I visited Slovakia in early March. And just a month later, in April, presidential elections were held here, won by a candidate with pro-Russian views. Now, when the politicians with such views have a complete control in Slovakia, it's likely that this year the Slovak sympathizers of Russia, Eurosceptics or far-right individuals will succeed in the European Parliament elections. Now there are 59 such members of parliament out of 705 in the European Parliament. This is a united group of MEPs with far-right views mainly from France, Germany and Italy. Historically, these three countries have the largest quota of MEPs among all EU countries. If in the previous elections only 14 MEPs from Slovakia were elected to the European Parliament, according to the quota of such a small country, there were 76 from Italy, 79 from France, and the most amount was from Germany, 96 MEPs. Although the votes of voters from each EU country are important, the electoral moods in Italy, France and Germany have a significant influence on the composition of the next European Parliament.
І головним прикладом тут є
And the primary example here is the Alternative for Germany, that is now the largest right-wing radical party in Europe, actually the pro-Kremlin one.
зміцнення цих сил.
The strengthening of these forces and increasing of their popularity in society cannot fail to influence the mainstream forces.
Це вже впливає.
This is already having an impact. We see that this is already influencing the debates in Germany. I am more than confident that such an ambivalent attitude of the German government towards even the supply of Taurus missiles is connected with this strengthening of Ukrainian skeptical sentiments that, in turn, are also linked to the strengthening of the extreme right and extreme left in Germany. In France, Marine Le Pen, the leader of the popular far-right party National Rally, dubbed Putin's girlfriend by the media, suddenly has criticized Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. Even last year, they hurried to repay the debt they had, 9 million euros they borrowed in 2014 to show that they distance themselves, that they don't have any connection to the Putin regime because the Putin regime has become too toxic for many, even far-right individuals.
Токсичним.
The situation in Italy is quite different. The most popular far-right party, Northern League, is led by Matteo Salvini. Before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, he did not hide his sympathies for Putin. Still, even after the invasion in fall of 2022, this fact did not prevent Salvini from becoming the Deputy Prime Minister of Italy. How did Salvini become the Deputy Prime Minister of Italy after such events, and how influential is his political power now? In Rome, I meet Luigi Sergio Germani, the director of the Institute of Social Sciences and Strategic Studies. Mr. Germani is an expert on internal and external Russian policy and hybrid warfare strategies. He was one of the first scientists in Italy to introduce the study of intelligence and national security to academic circles. Our meeting begins with Mr. Germani reading me a fragment of the text. Yeah, he's Italian. Even not Italian, but the European Trump, since he has now become for Europe the head of all of the ultra-right in Europe.
В Європі.
Yes, we're talking about Salvini. This is the text decoding of the conversation between Russians and three Italians. The voice of Matteo Salvini's assistant, identified by the last name Savoini, was recognized among the others. The communication took place at the Metropole Hotel in Moscow in 2018. Next year, the audio record of this conversation got to the journalists and was made public by them. The publication of this conversation caused quite a scandal because the whole point of the conversation between Salvini's assistant and Russians was the financing his campaign for the European Parliament. So we have Eni, who will be on the Italian side, yes? We have a Russian oil company on our side, and we have two companies in the middle. The bank, your bank, and one Russian company that will be signing the contract with the bank. This is the voice of a Russian who's explaining how the financial scheme will work. The Russians offer Salvini's party 4% of the annual contract for oil supplies that the Russian oil company and the Italian company Eni are to conclude. In annual terms, these 4% were supposed to convert into over $60 million for the Italian far-right party. This is 7 times more than the loan the Russians provided for the French far-right led by Marine Le Pen in 2014. The role of Matteo Salvini's assistant is also interesting. In this conversation with the Russians, he promoted himself very actively and literally tried to sell his political services to them. Salvini is the first man that wants to change all Europe together with our allies and colleagues and other parties in Europe. Freiheitliche Partei Österreich in Austria, German Alternative for Deutschland, France with Madame Le Pen, and other countries, for instance Hungary with Orban and Sweden. The idea was that Salvini would unify all of these far-right parties in Europe in order to change Europe completely. What was the idea of changing? Their narrative was that Europe is under control of some elite that oppresses the European masses. An economic elite and banking elite that are closely tied to the United States and NATO. And the economic policy of those elites hurts people. Was this idea popular among Italians? Well, it was widespread. The idea was that Italy had lost its sovereignty. And he was promoting it during the pre-election period, right? Yes, he was promoting this idea as well as the Russians. We call this phenomenon sovereignism. The idea was that Europe, the European Union, had taken away Italy's economic and political independence and had imposed economic policy that was impoverishing people. Italy had to regain its sovereignty. Suppose such a narrative gains popularity in the most influential European countries, in that case it will significantly weaken the idea of the united Europe. That's precisely what the Russians need. This is why they are interested in funding far-right parties in Europe. The leader of the Italian far-right, Matteo Salvini, denies accusations of attempting to receive money from Russia before the European Parliament elections of 2019. Whether trying to obtain that funding or not, Luigi Sergio Germani says the Russians did support Salvini to some extent. Our institute analyzed Russian propaganda. At that time, for example, Sputnik Italia and other media. They tried to depict Salvini as an emerging leader that would unify all of the European right. Eventually, Matteo Salvini's party garnered enough votes to enter the European Parliament. Since then, he has led a coalition of far-right parties there. It's interesting that the Russian money scandal erupted after the European Parliament elections. That was supposed to turn away his voters. Still, Salvini has retained his positions in Italy. He's the minister. He does not influence very much foreign policy, but he's still a member of the government. So he has influence. In the current Italian government, Matteo Salvini became an influential minister due to his party Lega that won the national elections in 2022. Back then, the Milanese party Brothers of Italy won. They needed the Lega party to form the majority. Although the party of Italy's incumbent Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni garnered the most votes 2022 national elections, those voices were not enough to form a government. In addition, the gap between them and the closest political opponents wasn't big. In such cases, significant parties begin to negotiate with smaller ones to form a coalition. This marks a golden opportunity for minor parties. Now the political climate and the fate of the entire country depend on their choice of the major party they decide to join. Matteo Salvini decided to make a coalition with Giorgia Meloni's party in exchange for an important ministerial position. One conclusion suggests in the story of Russian money in Italian politics. Russians use the core values of democracy, such as the right to vote for everyone and high party competition, as their weapon. In democratic system, even a small party sympathetic to Russia can have a decisive voice on the sensitive for the Russians issues. Following Russia's full-scale incursion into Ukraine, Matteo Salvini has somewhat distanced himself from Putin and doesn't wear t-shirts with his image anymore. Italy's example illustrates how the investing even in a small party can pay off over time. Gaining access to the individuals who are already in power or close to power has always been plan A for the Kremlin. Anton Chekhovtsov, a political expert and a renowned researcher of far-right movements, explains that Russians establish contacts with politicians in Europe through a proven methodology of intelligence agencies. In intelligence agencies, the abbreviation MICE denotes 4 types of recruitment of politicians or other individuals to carry out various tasks. M stands for money. This is one of the most common types of recruitment through money. At one time, money contributed to making Gerhard Schröder Chancellor of Germany and one of the most influential European politicians among the 2000s of them a sympathizer of the Russians. The Russians appointed Schröder to the board of directors of Rosneft and put him on a salary of over 200,000 euros per month. One Schröder equals several dozens of Marine Le Pens. Schröder provided Russia with direct access to the part of the German political elite. After the annexation of Crimea, Russian tactics changed. Due to the loss of reputation, they realized that they couldn't recruit politicians like Schröder for money anymore. So they switched to less influential political movements. They issued loans to the far right and negotiated funding for the far right in Italy. Those groups cooperated with the Russians because they disregarded international politics. The ideology of the far right and their nuclear electorate are solely focused on the internal affairs of their countries, such as the issue of migration or independence from the EU, in making important decisions for their countries. That's why, despite Russia's negative image, it manages to recruit far-right politicians for money. The second type is through ideology. I. Ideology. These people are close to you ideologically and sometimes don't even require money. They don't even need recruitment on a material basis, although there may be the rewards. They are willing to work based on ideological convictions. The following C stands for compromising materials. These are so-called compromising materials. When sensitive materials about a particular person, such as a politician, can be used by special services or other agencies to compel the person to perform certain actions. And the last E stands for ego. This is the use of human vanity, even healthy or unhealthy egoism, to get what is needed from a person. For example, it's providing Western experts and politicians access to high-ranking officials in Russia. Kremlin services do this often. They give this access precisely to stroke the egos of the people they want to recruit. One example of such events related to the use of ego
Це так званий
is the so-called Valdai Forum
спеціально націлений
that is aimed explicitly at Western experts, politicians, journalists, and academics
яких привозять
who are brought to Russia and allowed to meet not only with Putin,
але й з інших.
but also with other representatives of the Russian elite. Well, it seems that after a full-scale invasion, the tools like ideology and ego are not as effective as money and compromise in materials. Because who will support for ideological reasons the country aggressor that has openly invaded Ukraine? Who will go to Russia when sanctions have been imposed on Russia? I mean, if we talk about ego. Yes, now of course, ego doesn't work as effectively as before February 24, 2022, but ideology is still essential. There are people in the West who support, say, non-liberal ideologies that oppose the establishment
Проти істеблішменту.
and oppose the US and US influence in Europe.
Це також
This is also an ideological direction that Russia supports.
раніше знаходять у
They still find people in Western Europe who are ideologically close to them, and recruitment is still carried out in this direction as well.
Так, я згоден, що
Yes, I agree.
не так багато.
There is not as much vanity now, but money and ideology are the two main types of recruitment that are still prevalent.
Поширені.
The most mysterious element in this recruitment scheme remains the letter C, which stands for compromising material. Did Russians use compromising material to gain the loyalty of any European politicians?
Така, скажімо, впливова
There is, let's say, an influential viewpoint that the Russians have compromising material on Viktor Orban.
Бо коли Орбан прийшов до влади,
When Orban came to power, he was a prominent skeptic of Russia.
все змінилося після.
Everything changed after he went to Moscow and met with official representatives in Russia.
І коли він повернувся до Угорщини, його позиція
And when he returned to Hungary, his position changed.
такої теорії,
Supporters of this theory of compromising materials say that something was shown to him in Russia.
що у них щось
They told him that they had something on him. No matter how hard Russians have tried to recruit far-right politicians, they don't seem like a force that could sway Europe in Russia's favor today. This conclusion can be drawn at least because European far-right parties hold various positions on Russia's wide-scale invasion of Ukraine and do not present a united front on this issue. Those far-right and populist voices calling for negotiations with Russia and lifting sanctions are not too numerous in Europe.
Я ось тут знову
Once again, I am approaching this with cautious optimism. And I don't think Russia will stop being toxic anytime soon,
найближчою
or even
або навіть в
in the medium term. A favorable European political climate is important for Ukraine, not only in terms of financial and military assistance, but in terms of maintaining and strengthening sanctions against Russia. In 2022, the EU swiftly responded to Russia's full-scale invasion and imposed a strict package of sanctions on the very next day on February 25. Among all the restrictions, the sanctions in the technological sector were particularly important. It was the ban on exporting microchips to Russia. The role of microchips in modern military conflicts, modern defense and military technologies is critically important. If the Russians did not have access to foreign components, they would not have automated artillery, fire control systems, or such strategic aviation. Russians cannot manufacture microchips. This technology is only available to a few countries in the world. Yet, despite imposed sanctions, Russians still have access to Western microchips for 3 years during the full-scale invasion. The media frequently report this. The list of foreign companies whose products are found in Russian weapons was published in February of 2024 by the Kyiv School of Economics and the International Working Group on Yermak-Makfol sanctions. This list includes over 250 foreign companies. Such news leads to much speculation about whether the sanctions are effective or not. On the one hand, the presence of foreign components in Russian weapons may indicate a significant stockpile made by the Russians before the full-scale invasion. On the other hand, why hasn't this stockpile been depleted? Russia has already launched over 10,000 missiles and drones of various types in Ukraine. It continues to do so to this day. Perhaps the sanctions are indeed ineffective and Russians are obtaining foreign components for their missiles and drones bypassing the sanctions. How can we determine when exactly foreign components for missiles and drones got to Russia? What percentage of foreign microchips are in Russian weapons? I'm meeting with someone who has a unique access to Russian weapons and can answer these questions. This is Captain Andriy Rudik, a representative of the Research Center of Trophies and Prospective Armament and Military Equipment at the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. With special permission, we will investigate together the origin of microchips in Russian weapons. We will work with you on the components of the active radar seeker of the sea-launched cruise missile 3 M14 caliber complex. Here are these components. The Russians are launching caliber missiles from the Black Sea. Such missiles are capable of traveling hundreds of kilometers and have caused extensive destruction and hundreds of deaths throughout Ukraine. On July 14 of 2022, in Vinnytsia, 29 people were killed as 2 caliber missiles hit the city center. These missiles also reach Lviv. Russians frequently target Odessa with them. This is an FPGA matrix that is responsible for electronic computing operations. That is, it's something that the Russian Federation is currently unable to manufacture. Well, they try, let's say, to search for technological solution. They have their own developments, but we see that at the level of the same caliber, because the Russian Federation often boasts that 80% of caliber is assembled from Russian components. In fact, there are Russian components there in the onboard computer of this strategic sea-based missile. Still, the guidance system is of foreign origin. So if we imagine that Russians don't have these components, then this missile couldn't find its target. It would fly, but finding the target would be problematic. Then let's see where this microchip is manufactured. Here it is. This microchip is from the company Altera. Captain Rudik is not authorized to comment on the country of origin of this microchip. This is demanded by the policy of the Center for Trophy and Prospective Armament Research and Military Equipment where he serves. However, a simple internet search yields such information. The company Altera is of American origin with headquarters in California. Even basic information about the company Altera on Wikipedia gives us an important clue. In 2015, Altera was acquired by the American technological giant Intel and subsequently changed the labeling of these microchips. That is, they no longer bore the inscription Altera. This allows us to assume that this particular microchip with the old labeling found its way to Russia even before the full-scale invasion. Here's a microchip. It's a dual-use item. It's not military. This chip can be used on many devices, so we don't know where it came from. Most likely it was simply original manufactured somehow and the Russian Federation got it. On the same board from caliber missiles, we identified microchips from 2 other foreign manufacturers, Linear Technology and Hello Electronics. Both companies are also based in the United States of America. These are also dual-use microchips that Russia could easily procure in large quantities before the full-scale invasion. Restrictions on their export to Russia began to take effect only in 2022. Now we have to see if the foreign components manufactured after the imposition of sanctions are still making their way into Russia. For example, let's take the latest that is supposedly indicated as made in Russia. This is our Comet M navigation system. It concerns the navigation of the Shahed loitering munition. August of 2022. It says made in Russia. Assembled in Russia, not made. Made and assembled, these are 2 different things. Let's look at the antenna patch. The antenna patch is of foreign origin. They are installed so that they are jam-resistant and can withstand our electronic warfare assets. How can we understand that this patch antenna was manufactured in 2022? By its serial number. We transmit this information to foreign partners to determine was it really manufactured or not. Did you inquire when was it manufactured? Absolutely. And what answer did you get? That it was made after the full-scale invasion. Do you mean this patch antenna? Yes, I do. There are several routes for the delivery of Western microchips and essential components for weapons to Russia despite sanctions. The first route is through former Soviet Union countries such as Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan and Armenia. In these countries, intermediary firms purchase necessary foreign components abroad and resell them to Russia. The second route involves influential intermediary countries loyal to Kremlin, such as Turkey, the United Arab Emirates and China. Thus, despite Russians' bypass technological sanctions, these sanctions still significantly complicate their lives. The restructuring of logistic routes leads to increased cost of foreign components, delivery delays, and not always guaranteed delivery. It could be added that the significant increase in the cost of foreign components drains the Russian budget. This would also have its advantages. But it seems this factor does not create obvious problems for the Russian budget. The collapse of the Russian economy predicted by financial analysts at the beginning of the invasion did not happen. On the contrary, there is an increase in revenues in the Russian budget, forming all industry returning to the level before the full-scale invasion. This is happening despite Western sanctions force Russia to sell its oil almost at its cost. How is this possible? How do Russians, despite harsh sanctions, still manage to receive high revenues from oil? To figure this out, I came to Finland. Recently, this NATO country that shares thousands of kilometers long land border with Russia has experienced in the past a bold attack from its neighbor, resulting in the loss of some of its territories. Finland has always looked at Russia with suspicion, and 30 years ago it established a unique institute at the National Bank of Finland for studying the economies of Russia and China. I arranged a meeting with Heli Simola, the senior economist of this institute. She devoted the last 20 years of her career to studying the Russian economy. Can you explain it to us? What's going on with the Russian oil trade?
If you talk about the crude oil and oil products, it is estimated that about half of the exports is shipped by this kind of shadow fleet. Russia has been able to buy ships for itself, so it can use these ships to transport the oil, and of course, they are not limited by any price caps, because they just take care of the transport by themselves, not using the services provided by the countries under the sanctions.
Sanctions compel Russia to sell its oil at a reduced price of $60 per barrel if Russians use Western oil transportation services, Western tankers and insurance companies. To sell their oil, Russians took a bypass route using tankers registered in countries that have not joined the sanctions against the Kremlin. Often these are already decommissioned or old tankers with expiring service life. Nothing prevents Russians from loading these tankers with their oil and selling it at the average market price of $70 or $80 per barrel. This is how the shadow fleet, according to Heli Simola, operates.
It was expected that they would try to reorient the trade flows, at least to some extent. But of course, it might be a bit surprising that was this so fast and in such big amounts. They used their own tankers to ship the oil to all those key markets. These are China, India and Turkey. So these are the main buyers of Russian oil at the moment.
According to various estimates, the Russian shadow fleet consists of 600 to 1,000 vessels. One-third of these vessels is controlled by the Russian state shipping company Sovcomflot, while the rest are under the command of foreign traders who disregard sanctions.
As for the trade side, Russia has been quite successful in shifting its trade to new countries.
Can you tell me, because it's interesting information about the percentage of sanctions that really work?
If you look at the research that has been conducted on this issue, the general finding is that about 30 of the cases. So the sanctions totally or partially get to their aim.
Grey schemes in cheap imports and shadow fleet for oil exports indicate that the Russians have established good connections in illegal business. This is yet another dangerous tentacle of the Russian octopus. A company operating within the law can be held accountable. Still, all these companies that help Russians to bypass sanctions effectively are beyond the reach of Themis. Inaccessibility. Bedding deep at the bottom of the sea are the features of the octopus, a marine creature with 8 tentacles armed with dangerous suckers. The predator needs them to paralyze its prey and pull it into its jaws. The Russian octopus operates on the same principle. Only its tentacles are the influence schemes concocted in Kremlin. Each element in these schemes is like the suckers on the tentacles when activated paralyze their victim. The suckers on the tentacles of the Russian octopus are the dozens of so-called cultural representations of Rossotrudnichestvo around the world, hundreds of parishes of the Russian Orthodox Church in Europe, politicians and businessmen who sympathize with Russia and play into the Kremlin's hands. Today, the Russian octopus still looks menacing, but can be defeated. More and more people worldwide are realizing how it operates and uses its tentacles to spread its influence. Such knowledge is the first step to neutralizing it. Our team worked on this film for half a year. While we were editing it, the signs emerged that the West was moving to the next step, the intention to sever the tentacles of the Russian octopus. On April 17, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, in its resolution, recognized the Russian Orthodox Church as an instrument of Russian influence and propaganda. The following week, on April 22, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Sweden stated that sanctions targeting Russia's shadow fleet should be introduced. The Russian Orthodox Church and the shadow fleet are just 2 tentacles. But if action is finally taken against them, there is a hope that the food supply for the Russian octopus will soon run out, and this will be the beginning of its end.